Hi, today we're going to go over key features using a table. Now the three features that we're going to be going over are 1, the axis of symmetry, 2, x-intercepts, and 3, y-intercepts. Now the first one, axis of symmetry. Remember, the axis of symmetry is the point at which the graph can be reflected. So if you have a parabola, the axis of symmetry will cut the parabola in half such that I can go ahead and use this axis of symmetry to reflect it and they will match exactly the same. So now that we know, or now that we refresh our mind on this, we have to go ahead and look at our table and then think how this connects to the graph. Well, notice that for the graph that I have here, this point has to have the same y value as the other point, right? So in other words, if this point is here, then on the other side you should have another point that is actually at that same spot, but just on a different x value. So they have the same y value, but at a different x coordinate. So now we have to find that in our table. So in our table, basically what we have to find is the point at which if I go one up and then if I go one down, I get the same number. So let's go over how this would look. So let's say that I believe that -5, 2 is my axis of symmetry. So that means, so I'm talking about this number, -5, 2. That means that if I go ahead and if I go up 1 and I go down 1, I have to get the same number. In this case, are they the same number? In other words, is 12 equal to -4? No, it is not. So that means that -5, 2 is not my axis of symmetry. So -5, 2. So try to look and find where I can pick that point such that when I go one up and I go one down, I get the same number. So were you able to find it? I'll give you 5 more seconds. Okay, now that you have had some time to think about it, if you notice, the answer is going to be -3, -6. So -3, -6. And why is that? Because if I go one up, I get -4. And if I go one down, I get -4. You see? Now, what happens if I go 2? So let's go ahead and see what we get. So if I go 1, 2, and then if I go 1, 2, I get 2, and I get 2. So that makes me, that tells me that -3 is my axis of symmetry, and the vertex is at -3, -6, right? Now that you know this, that this is the axis of symmetry, you have to determine whether this is a minimum or a maximum. So how can we determine if this is going to be my minimum or my maximum? So there's 2 ways to do it. One is to imagine the graph. So imagine it. When I go one up and one down, is the number that I'm getting bigger or smaller than my -6? Remember, the closer you are to 0 for negative numbers, the bigger that number is. So in this case, they are getting bigger because -4 is closer to 0 than -6. So let's actually show this with the graph. So remember, -3, -6 is my axis of symmetry. So -3, -6, that would be somewhere around here. Let's make that in blue actually. And then we said that our other 2 points, so one down and one up, -4, -4. So -4 is somewhere around here. And then -2 gives me -4 as well, right? So we have -2, -4. So if you notice, this is actually a what? What kind of extrema is it? Is it a maximum or is it a minimum? it is a minimum because it is the lowest point of your graph, right? So this is a minimum. So now, how is this going to help us for our work? Well, one way that you can see this is you might see it in Delta Math. So let's go over in Delta Math this question. This is exactly the same question that I showed you on my notes. So again, what it's asking you is answer the questions below based on the graph of the quadratic function and a table selected values of the quadratic function g of x. So for the parabola that I have, notice that my minimum is at 3, -3, right? So that's going to be for this graph. For this graph, my minimum is at 3, or not -3, 3, -4. 3, -4 is my minimum. And then for this one, the one we did in the notes, it is going to be -3, -6. So now let's go over how you would fill this out. So first of all, are we talking about minimums or maximums? We're talking about minimums, so I click minimum. The value of f of x, so this value is what? Is -4. So -4 is the minimum. That's the lowest y value that I have. And now, and there is no maximum. There is no maximum because if you notice, this graph has arrows pointing up, meaning that it goes on forever. So there is no maximum value. The minimum of my g of x, now we're talking about the table, is, what is the minimum? Remember, the -3 is the axis of symmetry, and then my y value is going to be the minimum or the maximum. In this case, it's a minimum. So it's -6, and there is no maximum. And the reason for that is because it goes on forever. This is a parabola. Now, therefore, f of x, so this -4 has a, and what would that be? Is -4 greater than or smaller than -6? It is actually greater than. Has a greater minimum than the value of g of x. So remember, the closer you are to 0, the bigger that it is. That's why f of x has a greater minimum than the value of g of x. So let's check. It's going to ask you, you want to verify? And yes. So you go ahead and it shows you the answer and the way that you can work through it. But the key part really is just identifying the axis of symmetry. Again, how do you find it? Well, you go ahead and you find the point at which if you go 1 up and 1 down, you get the same thing. And then just to verify, you should go ahead and try doing it 2 up. So 1, 2, 1, 2. And yes, you get the same exact number. Therefore, the axis of symmetry is at -3. Okay, so now let's go over how do you find the x-intercept. So for the x-intercept, you first have to remember what is the definition of an x-intercept. So I went ahead and I wrote it down below. The x-intercept occurs when what is equal to 0. So what needs to be equal to 0 in order for us to have an x-intercept? So remember, it's always the opposite. So if I'm having the x-intercept, then my y has to be equal to 0. So in other words, the right-hand side has to be equal to 0. So in this case, this is my 0. So therefore, my x-intercept is going to be 2. Okay? Now, how is this different from the y-intercept? Well, the y-intercept occurs when what is equal to 0? What must be equal to 0? Think about it. The x-intercept occurs when y equals equal to 0. Therefore, the y-intercept occurs when x is equal to 0. So now for the y-intercept, we're looking for when x is equal to 0. So that would be this one. Notice that for these questions, they're always going to give you the other one as well. So they went ahead and gave us the x-intercept for this one, but they're asking for the y-intercept, not the x-intercept. They're trying to confuse you in this way. So you have to be able to identify which one is the x-intercept and which one is the y-intercept. And you always find it by thinking about the other variable. So x-intercept occurs when y is equal to 0 and the y-intercept occurs when x is equal to 0. So now let's go ahead and look at how this would look in your work. So we have here, if I can open it. Yes. So we did this question. So we have this line, and they're asking us answer the questions based on the graph below. So we have the same numbers. Let me see. Let me try to make this smaller so that we can see it more clearly. So yes, we have the same numbers, right? And then we circled our 2, 0 to be our x-intercept. The x-intercept of f of x, so that would be the top one. The x-intercept, would that be 7 or would that be 1? Well, which one is the x-axis? The x-axis is this horizontal line. Therefore, my x-intercept is 1. And then for the other one, my x-intercept is 2. So that means that the top one, which is f of x, is smaller than the one that we have on the bottom, which is g of x. So the x-intercept of f of x we said was 1. And the x-intercept of g of x is 2. Therefore, f of x has a smaller x-intercept than our g of x. Okay? And like I said, they're always going to go ahead and give you the y-intercept as well, just to try to confuse you. So pay attention and try to remember that you always go ahead and find the x-intercept when y is equal to 0. And now let's go over to our last problem. So the last type of problem is when they are asking you about the y-intercept. In this case, they gave us a parabola. So the y-intercept of the parabola is when the y axis is intersected by the function, or when the function intersects the y-axis. In this case, that would be at 6, right? So if I go ahead and zoom in, you'll notice that it's at 6. And now for the next one, we go ahead and find our y intercept when x is equal to 0, so therefore it's 2. So we're working with 2 and 6. So which one's bigger, the top one or the small or the bottom one? The top one, right? So the y-intercept of f of x is 6. Remember, 6. And the y-intercept of g of x is 2. Therefore, f of x has a greater y-intercept than g of x. And we go ahead and submit. And this is correct, and it's going to give you an explanation on why it is that way, why it is correct. And that's it for me, guys. Hope you guys learned something. And if you have any questions, make sure that you go ahead and ask me for help. That's it. Bye, guys.